point, and I'm very pleased indeed to be able to introduce our next speaker, Professor Anne Trefethen. Anne is going to be talking to us today about dealing with Data NeuroHub, a case study. Just a little about Anne. She's recently become Chief Information Officer at the University of Oxford and is a Professor of Scientific Computing at the university. She's the former Director of the Oxford E-Research Centre. She's been a researcher, developer and leader in high-performance computing technologies and algorithms since 1989 and a leader in e-science since 2001. Before joining Oxford, Anne was Director of the UK e-science core programme, having been the Deputy Director for 4 years. And the core programme focused on generic issues for e-science applications. Anne has worked for almost 20 years in industry and academia with a focus on numerical algorithms and software. And one of the things that she mentioned to me just now was that she recalls coming out. She was here a few years ago at the time before we were getting all the research going in this country, and was in fact working with the ARC, going around explaining to people about e-science and how it was working in the UK. So it's a particular pleasure to welcome her back to Australia and to this conference to come and talk to us this evening.
So thank you very much, Nick. It is an absolute delight to be here. I'm so glad that you invited me, particularly before I agreed to be the CIO, because I could then claim, oh, I'm sorry, I have to go away to Australia for a while. I have to congratulate the organisers on this meeting. I found it really invigorating conference. The standard's great. I've penciled it in for next year, so thank you very much. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you today, say a little bit about data in general, and then I want to focus in on a particular project that we have had in the UK, leading at Oxford. That's a very small project in some sense, but from which we've learned a great deal, and I hope I can communicate some of that. Let me just say a few things about the Oxford E-Research Centre. As Nick mentioned, I was the director of that until this summer, and now my colleague Dave DeRoe has taken over as director. The centre's now, I guess, about 6 years old, in a university where things have often been done for centuries in a certain way, and so to do things differently is not always a natural thing to do. But where there is a lot of researchers who are keen to embrace technology, and so we've been working with groups across the university. We're engaged in the computational components for the Square Kilometre Array, so we feel a connection with Australia, although we're so far away. We are involved in some of the projects that were mentioned this morning, the European projects in Pandata and CRISP. So we're used to these large issues of data, but we're also engaged with the digital humanities. So I thought the presentation this morning about digital humanities or embracing that was extremely good, and certainly something that we are engaged with too. So we're all waiting, or we're all got this imminent flood of scientific data from experiments, simulations, sensors and satellites, and we've seen that throughout the meeting, I think, in terms of the geosciences, the physics applications today, and of course this image is from CERN, from the LHC, which has indeed flooded us all with huge amounts of data and with good results. And my colleague Christine Borgman gave me this image, which I think captures it very well. We are down at the bottom, by the way, in case it's not clear, and the flood is upon us as we try to figure out what is it that we do with this data. The publishers are in there, the universities are in there, the librarians, and I was delighted to meet many librarians at this meeting who are engaged in these issues around data and this deluge that we're having to deal with. I've just been to the talk by my colleague at JISC, who was saying that we should be collaborating very closely on these issues with Australia, and I'd like to second that, because we have, I think, a lot of synergies that we could make the most of. And as we're all aware, we're generating huge amounts of data. Every day, each one of us is creating digital data by the masses, using our loyalty cards, putting our photos on Flickr, even using electricity. We're now creating lots of data on these smart grids, and I see that Australia has rolled out these smart electricity meters in a way we haven't yet in the UK. And YouTube, as we speak, hours and hours of video are being uploaded to YouTube for people to watch, and millions, billions are being viewed every day. So huge amounts of data that we are generating. And is it any surprise to learn that there are now, this is a little out of date, so I'm sure that it's much more, that many billions of mobile devices that are then creating content and using that content. And I think we've just come in our day-to-day lives to accept that we can Google something to see what it's about. We can get data about things, and certainly in the UK with our open data, we can get information about all kinds of things that we might at one time not assumed. I gave a presentation similar to this in 2009, and yesterday I went to some of the talks about EBI and the integration with the databases at UQ, and it reminded me of this slide. So I went and pulled it out this morning. And this in 2009, this is a map that is available on the EMBL website, and each of those dots is a data source, and you can then dive into that to find information about it. And on November 25th in 2009, the map showed almost 17 million, over 13,000 locations. So I looked at it this morning and noted that in the time between then and now, it's gone up to 62,000 locations and almost 19 million entries. So this is the pace at which we are collecting. This is data essentially about ourselves, and taken from the EBI, you can see, so that these graphs are the different databases there, and the bottom axis is time. It goes up to 2010 from 2000, and you can see for many of them in the last few years how we are just dramatically able now to collect these data sets. And indeed there's a wealth of information on the data set that shows you. And just the ENA is accumulating 5 million bases per second. So it's just vast amounts. And we're also generating data about ourselves. So medical imaging, these are different types of medical imaging, and the total number of scans per 1,000 population is about 2,500, and this is the distribution of it. And this is the amount of data that translates into. So almost 1 million DVDs per 1,000 population is being stored about us. Now, in the sciences, of course, well, in research in general, I should say, the interest is how we use that data. What's the infrastructure that needs to be there to enable us to use it? And this is a slide that my colleague Liz put together now several years ago, but it shows you how the experimentation may create the data, it may be stored and analysed and then put into a digital library. It may then be rediscovered. It could be used in learning, for graduate students, undergraduates. And within that, there's a social process as well as a technical process. And I think we tend to forget that as we build infrastructure. Infrastructure is not just the nuts and bolts, it's not just the software, it's how we interact with it, it's how we are part of the infrastructure. And so if you look at that in the social setting, what you see is the same type of, I was a bit eager there, the same type of interactions, but at the same time we're creating information, the metadata, provenance, and there's now a social element to the use of it. So, and this is very much, certainly in the younger generation, I think, almost live in the, some of my colleagues almost live in the virtual social world than in the physical social world. So as we develop the infrastructure for data, and as we deal with the tools for infrastructure, we need to consider this social context. We also need to be thinking about how we interact with the data, and that's not just about how we calculate over it, but how do we visualize it? How do we understand it? And a lot of that will be through visualization, through such technologies, through ways in which we, and as we saw this morning, through immersive environments, going to be incredibly important. And creating data that we can link. So this is one of our digital humanities projects, where the data about certain digital artifacts is in linked data so that it's been able to collaborate with similar institutions across Europe to be able to search and bring together information about specific artifacts. So, given all of that, data is at the heart of our understanding. If you look through the literature now, you'll see lots of things about data scopes, data observatories. We see here at this meeting a lot of talk of virtual observatories. The data is essentially the component that holds that together. I don't know if any of you are aware of the flagship activity Future ICT in Europe, but this is building what they're calling knowledge accelerators. And this is essentially using data as for social data that's collected from social activities to be able to compute over that and to be able to predict and give information, creating social machines as they are. And talking with some of my social science colleagues, occasionally concerned that we are moving from a time when we collect data for a purpose to a time when we use data to create the hypothesis. I think a lot of scientists are not uncomfortable with that. We can tell trends from data, and it doesn't mean that scientific method is obsolete, but just we are moving to a new paradigm. And I'm sure, how many of you are familiar with this book, The Fourth Paradigm? Yes, Tony Hayes probably been through and scattered it across Australia. But it gives a number of areas where data is absolutely at the heart of the science. So now we've got the data, assuming that we understand what the data is, there are some generic problems that scientists and researchers face. And that is the tools around it, how we integrate it, how can we bring data sets together from one area to another, how can we share it. Although for many of my colleagues, actually, I think data mining is data mining. But we are now all signing up to the fact that we have to share our research outputs. They've been funded, those that have been funded publicly in the UK, we are now expected will be made available for reuse by others. So how can we help researchers do that? And of course, there are many big programs that are looking at this across the board. How do we build infrastructure? I've looked at several here in Australia during this visit, and they all have these generic issues of acquiring the data, ensuring the data has appropriate metadata to be able to describe it, share it, having the right tools, being able to do data analysis and data mining, being able to disseminate it effectively, publishing it in some way, and then archiving and preservation. And again, another issue that now as a CIO I have to think about: how are we going to archive and preserve data? In the UK, we have been asked by one of the research councils to do that for 20 years past the last access. So it's quite a big issue for us. And we're focusing a lot on tools, on ontologies, particular ontologies, on methods. And I would say for every data collection, there is likely a new method that goes with it. And I think one of the very important things that we need to focus on is actually the skills, and that's absolutely part of infrastructure. And as I said, to build effective infrastructure is really about that engagement with individuals and ensuring that we have the appropriate skills. So, to NeuroHub. So NeuroHub is a research information environment for neuroscientists. It was funded by JISC in the UK, who fund a lot of, not really research, but development of infrastructure. This was unusual in that it was quite a large grant for JISC. I haven't put it on there. It's about £1.3 million. So it's not a huge infrastructure grant, but it is a large one for JISC, and it's a 4-year project. And it says 3 years, but it's actually just over because we had it extended. And it's 4 FTEs, so it's 4 full-time equivalents. So it's not a huge project. We had an advisory group of Mark Ellisman from UCSD, Jim Austin from York, and Paul Watson from Newcastle. And our aim was to work with neuroscientists in Oxford, in Southampton, and in Reading, the universities that were involved, and to build them an infrastructure that they could share data across it, that they could use tools effectively, and to do all those generic things, but actually in their labs. So it's an eResearch South project, and just to say a little bit about what that means. Oxford leads a platform across the UK, a regional activity called eResearch South. And it's set off as Southampton, Reading, Oxford universities, and the eScience Laboratory at the Science and STFC. We've now got a number of other universities on that platform. And essentially, it's a network where we can pump prime projects, where we can pump prime collaboration, and where we can share best practice and bring together workshops, work with industry together and the like. And this particular project came about all because of British Rail, actually. When one of my colleagues was on the train got stopped, and he's a very chatty person, David Wallam, for those of you who might know him, quite a chatty individual, got chatting to the person next to him, who happened to be a neuroscientist, and was complaining about the fact that, oh, well, all this technology stuff is really great, except we can't actually use it. And David took this up as a challenge, and it became our project to build this. So this is the team. On this side of the top of the arc, the Oxford, my Oxford colleagues, myself, this is how it's set off. You might, for those of you who know Dave Derore, he's down over on the Southampton side at this stage because he was at Southampton University. The top arc is at Southampton. Colleagues on the bottom are from Reading. Partway through the project, David came over to Oxford, and we got a new collaborator in Reading. And very sadly, last week, our colleague Mark Baker, who has been ill for some time, passed away. So it was he was one of the people who set up the project, but sadly is no longer with us. So, why did these neuroscientists engage with us? Well, they have particular questions that they want to answer. Nigel Emptage, who is the neuroscientist in Oxford, is working on issues around memory. Why do young people learn more easily than older people? Now, he actually does his work with rats, but we'll assume that rats are like people for this basis. And he's done studies looking at nerve cell activity in rats that have shown that younger brains do things more easily and more efficiently. The way that he does this is through high-resolution fluorescent imaging and electrophysiology, collecting electrophysiology data. So here we're seeing a neuron, which they've been using laser imaging to capture information about. And in Southampton, we have two colleagues, Phil Newland and Vincent O'Connor, who work in the neuroscience lab there. And they're particularly interested in understanding the organization of neuronal networks. And they're studying various insects and worms to understand better the processes that they are going through. In particular, Phil's focusing on insects, on locusts and the like. So he comes to Australia quite a lot. You've got some interesting insects here, apparently. And the questions that he's trying to answer is, how is it that with so few neurons, insects are able to have the agility that they have? How is this happening? What's the combination in the neurological system that allows them to do this? And he is using electron microscopes. You can see the images here that he's collecting, and he's then measuring receptors on those. So he's got electrophysiology data too, to collect information about what it is, what's happening when, and how are they actually, how do these things combine to be able to give insects the capabilities that they have. And you can see from this particular image where the information is being collected and stored by particular tools that they have been using for some time. And here, again, using a digital microscope, collecting information from locusts, again, on cells, to be able to see the behavior of the cells at particular points. And the equipment in the lab in Southampton is a variety of electron microscopes, sensors that they're collecting information from, and clearly those are not going to change. But they are different from those that our colleagues in Oxford are using. And none of these instruments have a standard format. So they create something which then is very difficult for the scientists to share readily unless they happen to have the same format. I should apologise, I wanted to show you this video, but I don't have the video at the back of it. But Vincent is working with C. elegans, and essentially he likes to say he's looking at what drunk worms do. And so these are in ethanol, and you can see, when you see the worms, you can see how they behave, and you can see how bendy they are and which directions they go in. And now what they want to be able to do with this is they want not only to collect these videos, which are again a different type of data, but they want to be able to track. So they want software that's going to track the worms so they can see what's happening automatically. Reading came along later in the game in the sense of having a neuroscientist who was working with us. But Doug Sadie joined us, and he's the director of the Center for Integrative Neuroscience and Neurodynamics. And the one thing I've learned from this project, which many of you may already know, is there's no such thing as a neuroscientist, because they're completely different in what they do. It's such a broad church. It can involve any number of types of science. And generally, the teams involve mathematicians, computer scientists, as well as chemists, pharmacologists. And in this case, the work that Doug and his team are engaged in is around MRI scans. So they're doing a lot of work around the brain, about behavior. And so, again, a completely different set of tools, completely different kind of data, much bigger sets of data, very different requirements in terms of being able to manipulate this data, what you want to be able to do with it. And in this case, issues, because there are patients generally involved, of confidentiality and security that there aren't when you're looking at drunken worms. Nobody really cares which worm it was who behaved badly. But we do have some concerns about confidentiality of individuals who are going through the MRI. And here again, there's a very strong team of mathematicians who are working to do computational modelling around this. I should say in Southampton, the neuroscience lab is very much engaged with other departments in the university to be able to do the types of analysis they're doing. So they work with the engineers, they've got mathematicians who are working with them on the algorithms. So a very distributed team often, and very different sets of requirements. So when we set off on the project, we asked them, our TAME neuroscientists, to tell us, what is it that you want from us? What is it that you want us to do? And so the next few slides are the actual slides that Nigel Emtich used in our first discussions about what they wanted. And these are his pictures. So he wants to go from his experiments, he's going to do an experiment, and it would be really nice to be able to record what that experiment was. And he wants to do the analysis, and then he wants to publish it, and he wants to disseminate it. That's all. So, okay. And by the way, his experiments use all of these things. They use different tool sets, they use different facilities. They're sometimes in his lab and sometimes they're not. He uses software that is proprietary, and he uses software that's being developed by groups that then they disappear and he's not sure how to then get that software supported. They use different kinds of software, Java, Fortran, C, and in fact, yes, some of their work's done on a machine that they don't switch off anymore because it might not come back on. And that operating system hasn't been upgraded because we've got this piece of software that runs on it and they'll only run on that piece of software. So, and to do their analysis, they use MATLAB, Maple, you name it. And it's very clear that even within a single lab, even within a single group, there's no kind of standard. So one person at one bench will be using Mathematica. Another one, the next bench, will be using MATLAB. And they want to be able to share algorithms, but they don't share software. And it's really very interesting, very lacking in standards, so very difficult to find a generic solution to. And when it comes to publication, well, yeah, they use Word, they use Excel, they use Adobe. So I think a typical set of tools. And when we try to abstract that, essentially it's taking we've seen this cycle, I've seen this cycle in other presentations here, so I know it's not new, but to be able to abstract what they wanted to do, I think was helpful for the colleagues we had in neuroscience, who, when we stepped back, said, yes, this is what we want to do. We have an idea. We want you to help us capture the experimental design, to capture the data collection, and then everything that we do with that data. Wasn't clear when we talked to them what they meant by data, but as we went forward, we began to understand. So the way we approached this was we decided that the only way we could really understand how they worked was to embed the developers into the labs. So they would go and work in the labs and they'd watch. And I would say this was successful for some of our colleagues. We did structured and unstructured interviews. We then collated all the information. To be able to do that really well, though, you really need to be an ethnographer. You can't send in a developer to do that, as we discovered. We tried to get colleagues to look at, well, are there existing standards that you could be using that would help you, actually? And we've managed a little bit on that. We decided we'd use agile development methods, and I'll come back to that in a moment. And then we decided we'd look at what other projects in this area are there that we should be building on, because we're only a small project, we can't do all this ourselves, we need to bring in some elements from other places. And we need to keep the neuroscientists at the centre. It was really easy in meetings for colleagues to start talking about this web app or XML and my neuroscience colleague, I could see them just disappear. And eventually they'd say, I'm sorry, I have no idea what you're talking about. So it's very important to keep them at the centre if you're really going to try to solve their solutions. So the challenges that we faced, well, they were interdisciplinary teams. They had very different expectations, and even within the teams, they had within the 3 teams, they had different requirements and different cultures. There was already a culture in Southampton of sharing information, although it wasn't easy. There was a culture of sharing data sets, if somebody had done something to share that. As I mentioned, standards is an issue. Data formats, all of the electron microscopes had different data formats. There were some areas where we could resolve that, but not in others. And metadata standards. So for a lot of the information coming off the scopes, that was fine. There's quite a lot of metadata there. But for the researchers to capture that effectively wasn't always necessarily easy. And then the complexity of tools in the community. And I note one at the bottom which says network. Now, when our developer went to sit in the Oxford lab, we discovered that they were sharing all their information on sticks. They were taking from one machine and walking across the lab and putting it somewhere else. And they would pass it around. And we said, well, the simple thing would be simply to set you up a repository right here before we do anything else. Oh, that won't work. They said, that won't work. When we looked closer, it turned out that their laboratory had not even a shoestring of network connecting one side of it to the other. So just moving data, their experience had been, you can't move data from there to there because it just takes too long. So it's better for me to carry it. So the first thing was to fix the network. So collecting the user requirements, as I said, manage the data through the experimental life cycle. There was also a requirement that whatever we build, it was usable by researchers, but also by their students and by the PIs. And my colleagues made it clear that the requirements for a PI might be different from those of a student. So they wanted it to be absolutely usable. as I've said, to provide support for their images and to be able to support annotated images and to be able to search across their collections for not only images, videos, electrophysiology data and the like. They wanted to have a consistent annotation for data archiving, which was something that was true in one of the labs, but not necessarily in all. So they hadn't really figured out that, well, to be able to share, we need to have a consistent annotation. They wanted things to be web-based, which was great, a web-based repository, dealing with the many formats, and they wanted to be able to share the literature, most of which was in PDF, so they wanted to be able to do a searchable PDF space. And then we took down the requirement of a blog interface. This does come out of our requirements analysis, that they wanted to be able to blog. And to be able to work with colleagues across the universities, but also internationally, and to be able to do that securely, because some of this information is not stuff they just want to let go. We had to look at related projects, reuse, reuse, reuse. I think if you're reusing, then you're more likely to be sustainable. We didn't want to have to reinvent. We didn't want to have to re-implement everything that existed. And we didn't want to create a monolithic something. We wanted to be able to integrate into things. It was a relatively small project, and so we needed to leverage. I'll just quickly give you a view of some of the landscape at that time. In Southampton, there was CombiChem that had developed electronic lab notebooks. So we thought that we might be able to take the electronic lab notebooks from there and use those. And also at Southampton, there was development of a blogging environment called Blog3 that could manage experimental devices, that would allow you to share, that allow you to do experiment blogging and to capture that and to create visual and easy ways to, so that we thought would be suitable too. There's a big project in the UK called Carmen in the neurosciences. This was, so this had $4.5 million funding in its first round. It had a second round, and so it has been not only a lot of investment, but a lot of investment over time, so a lot of experience built up. So we felt that we needed to learn from this. The only problem for us was, again, it was quite focused and focused only on electrophysiology data, so only a small element of what we needed to be able to do. But they had created an environment that allowed you to annotate data, to search across data. And importantly, they had come up with some standards which they were promoting. So what did we think we would do? Well, we thought CombiChem and Blog3 might be elements we could put together, use the standards from Carmen, and possibly use my experiment, which I haven't mentioned. So our first approach for version 1.0 was first of all get the network fixed, and then build on these established tools, create the repository, work on the interfaces, work with the neuroscientists, and essentially iterate. So that was our plan. And this was what it looked like, kind of. And we did that, and it didn't work, and we threw it away. And looking at why it hadn't worked, it didn't work because we hadn't really captured very well, although we'd been sitting with them for hours, captured very well the requirements. We hadn't really got the software development environment in a strong enough way in which that we could support that agile interaction with users. The software we were building on wasn't stable enough for us to be able to build on it. And at the end of the day, it couldn't quite do what the neuroscientists wanted. So although it kind of worked, it didn't work at all for them. So, and we were fortunate that we had neuroscientists who were willing to say, I'm not going to use it because it doesn't work. That was that. So we threw it away, and we went onward and upward. What we had learned, we'd learned a huge amount about what they needed. We'd learned a huge amount about what wouldn't work. And we were able then to put that into a new environment. We moved to using Drupal Commons. If you're familiar with Drupal, it's an environment that's got a large user base across the US and UK, and probably here, I'm not sure, but a large user base. So it's and we built against user stories. So we created user stories. We changed our model of how we worked. So the practice that we used was continual and frequent feedback. So we created over 100 user stories, going back to our original information and sitting down and going through with the users, creating scenarios and using those to prioritize development. Accepted testing was then done against those user stories. This is how I want to use the environment. Does it work like that? Yes, it does. Continuous integration, so building essentially every night. There are 3 builds, a quick, a standard, and now there's a prototype that builds in the cloud. And release management, so configuration, you can look at the configuration details down there, but issue tracking, so you could say this is a problem, it will pop up on the stack. So essentially building it as we would an enterprise piece of software. And that allowed the users to engage with it much better. We could still probably have done better, but it moved us along a great deal. So if you look under the hood of now NeuroHub number 2, version 2, it's Drupal. It has a file system that's on Alfresco, so it's all open source. And we've managed to do things that will allow the users to integrate those tools that they want to integrate. So we've integrated the tools they already use for their PDF storage and searching. We've integrated Google Docs and Google Calendars because that allows the collaboration to not to have to move away from technologies that they know, but to be able to use them in a collaborative way. We've built into that some tools from other places. We've used the Carmen standards, and we've built into it some tagging abilities that have come from other projects in neurosciences. And one thing I'll mention in a minute is we've been using digital pens, and there's now a capability through a desktop client that's integrated with NeuroHub to be able to run workflows on the cloud. So let me just show you what it looks like. Oops. Well, you can't see that, but when you see it online, you'll see there's a nice architecture there that will explain it all. So this is what it looks like. A NeuroHub instance, this is what it would look like when you open it up out of the pack. This is, by the way, going to be released next month. It's all been designed so you should be able to install it quickly without having to have a degree in computer science. And this is what it will look like. So you can, it comes out, we call it NeuroHub, but actually other groups are now taking it on, so it could be whatever you want it, hub, home hub. You can then create it to look as you want it to look. One of the facilities that we've built in using Drupal is groups. So groups can create, an individual can create a group. You can become a member of a group. So it creates a community. You can then share blogs and information. You can then share your information across that group. This is the interface to Alfresco, which is the file management piece of it. So you can manage files and metadata in Alfresco integrated into Drupal. And there's also within that an interface that allows you just to include the files on your machine. So you can easily integrate your existing environment into this shared environment. It supports lab books. And this is what a lab book would look like. So a lab book can be a number of pages that are collected with information for your experiment. You can upload files to be included in that. And if you upload them, then metadata is captured into Drupal for you to be able to share that readily. One of the neat things that I thought would never work, be of interest to anybody, or anyway, is digital pens. So it turns out that the digital pens, the neuroscientists have found them quite useful, because not only do they record what you're writing, but they also have audio on them. And we've been able to program the API so that if you're writing, if you draw 2 lines, you write NeuroHub, you draw 2 lines and tap it, it automatically uploads to the page on your logbook. So it connects it in to so you can be taking notes about the experiment, or if you're in the dark, as some of our neuroscientists are, you can be speaking about the experiment and it's capturing it, and then it can be loaded into the lab book. Who'd have thought it? The other thing about the lab book that we found, again, that wasn't really a plan, but the lab leaders can now see what everybody's doing. So they can see what their students are doing in their experiment, and if there's something that they've done a little bit wrong, or they should have collected a different piece of data, they can see that happening. So they can go to them and say, I can see you've done this experiment, but actually we now need to do such and such. Something that we hadn't really appreciated, kind of opening up what's happening in the lab. Of course, there is search capability. We adopted the mini standards, as I said, and the taxonomy manager we've brought in from somewhere else. That allows you to create your own taxonomies. So at the moment, there is RDF in there, and there are some ontologies that have been used by the groups, but it's not as much as we would have liked to have done. And I think if we continue on development in this, this is an area we will work further on. But with the taxonomy manager, you can create your own vocabularies as you go along. These are snapshots from the use of it in Reading, where the centre is actually adopting it for everything that they do. So here there's some of the groups that they have developed, and the MRI, which is also now being booked through this. So this is just showing you the calendar features and things. Oh, and there's a shout box, so you can make an announcement to everybody in the group. And so SIN and the MRI, using the MRI, everything that they're doing, they're now adopting this environment to do it through. So they've got their members there, they're blogging, they're communicating, they've got the logbooks there, but also they're using it to book the facilities, so everything about the collaboration. And these are some snapshots from a lab book there by one of the researchers. So this is showing some of the jobs running on their systems, and he's brought that into his analysis, and you can see the different pages that one can have in the lab book. And similarly, on a different, so this is viewing a lab book, you see edit, captures the revisions, etc. So it's been, in terms of usage, it seems to have met the needs of many of the individuals. At Reading, they had another project which they've integrated into NeuroHub, and this allows them to run automatically on the cloud to do some of their computation on those big data sets that I mentioned from the MRI, from doing brain mapping. And as it's running, it automatically creates pages in their logbook, so they can check how the computation is going, what's happening, and the results are then all stored on their logbook. So this is something, again, we hadn't planned on doing, but actually it turns out to be very useful. And it means that they can share workflows within Reading to be able to do the same experiments on the data. I couldn't resist putting this forecast in, cloudy with a chance of semantics. is from my friend Tony. So at the moment, we're coming to the end of this just over 3-year project, and we've got some adoption of using the site and the tool set across it. And I would say that at Reading, they've just adopted it, it seems, completely. It seems to match their requirements completely. Southampton, again, they've been very effective in using it and having their colleagues in Japan and in Australia be able to share their data and their analyses with them. So again, we seem to have managed to do that there. In Oxford, I think we've perhaps made less progress, and in a way, some of the progress, they're not using the front end, they're using the back end, and they're using it to set up their hierarchy of data storage and to be able to capture things, and they are using the pens to some extent at the moment. But when I look at where we are 3 years into the project, we have certainly, as a community, moved forward. So, in conclusion, I think with this small project, we have managed to find a way in which we could capture the research processes very well. I think what we've learned is that for these disciplines are different. They vary enormously. And whereas we have built infrastructure for physicists, we've built infrastructure for astrophysicists, we've even been building infrastructure for musicologists. But somehow the neuroscientists, in their breadth of requirements, really needed to have a personalized system, a system that they could really adapt easily, that's sustainable, and that they don't need to worry about where it runs and things. For their own laboratory. And I show this paving because I tend to think of the neuroscientists having these stepping stones already in place. They weren't going to move those. They had these building blocks. And we had to kind of pour ourselves in between that to be effective. So we're kind of maybe that's not we're not grass, are we? We're maybe the glue, but... and we're finding that other areas are now picking it up and running with it. I think I've said this. If you want to learn more, there's a nice article in the newsletter. And we have a site, neurohub.ac.uk, which is a hub site. It isn't an operative site, but it's if you go there, you can download the software, the documentation, user guide, etc. We would love people to pick it up and to work with us. As I said, Drupal has a huge community support, and so we are hoping to sustain this through the benefits of that. Installation should take minutes, and please do your best. Thank you. Any questions?
Alex Reid. Thank you very much, Anne. It's lovely to see what's been happening at Oxford. 2 questions relating to your final remarks. Are you suggesting, since you've built something which is personalised to the particular needs of neuroscientists, that therefore it would only apply to neuroscientists?
No.
That's the first part of the question. The second part is, I've forgotten the second part, but go ahead.
I'll answer the second part first. No, that isn't what I meant to say. What I meant to say is that the environment is sufficiently flexible that you can personalize it. So you can use the tools that you're used to using. You can create the look and feel of the environment quite easily as you want it to be. So you can incorporate a calendar if you want. You can do all of those things. It's a relatively easy thing to be able to do. But it does have the power of the back end with the data and metadata support.
The other aspect of personalising is that you said that they had particular needs because they had a variety of software that they were used to and so on. Does that reflect the fact that they've grown up like Topsy, and that if they'd taken a more systematic approach to their developing tools for their needs, that you might not need to have personalised it to such a great extent?
Yeah, I think that's probably true. I think it's partly that, as I said, in the neuroscience lab, people have come from very different environments: chemistry, pharmacology, computer science, sometimes, I suppose, mathematicians, very different. They've come up maybe in their undergraduate and graduate training using certain tools, and they bring those to the table. And then, as I said, also, there's the issue around the vendors of the machines and facilities that are being used in this area, all having their own standards to some extent, and so driving requirements for different tools. Oh.
Question up here. I'm curious to know whether you've had to deal with the question of proof of invention through the system. So if a system like this was proposed in my context, I'd get about 30 seconds into the discussion and the IP lawyer in the room would say, oh, sorry, you've got to have a paper notebook with someone's signature on the bottom.
Right, so absolutely, this isn't replacing so the electronic notebook isn't at this time replacing the physical notebook. And indeed, in Southampton, where they're using the lab notebook part of it, or they plan to use that with their students, they will still have to have the physical notebook signed. However, the fact that they have been able to capture that digitally and to integrate it with the data and the other elements of the experiment, they see as incredibly valuable, and are, I think, to some extent, hoping that in the future they won't need that physical notebook. But you're absolutely right. At this point, it's in parallel with. And I think as long as it's providing a richer environment than the physical notebook, then I think they're on a winner.
G'day, Anne. Mark McPherson, RDSI. I just have a question with regard to that last question and in regard to the physical notebooks. Because you're using the digital pens, are they not writing things down anyway with those digital pens, and therefore that could constitute part of the physical notebook? Yeah. Or is it more than that, or is it that's what they're using to yeah. sign off? And I guess my second follow-up question would be, and it just occurred to me that perhaps they could, and I know this sounds horrible and waste of trees, but you could theoretically print the digital notebook out on paper and then sign it, I guess, if you really, really needed to. Just thinking out loud here. Thanks.
Yeah, I'm not sure on the legality of that, but I would agree. And you would think that notebooks get lost. I don't know. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Anne, for a tremendous presentation. It's great to see you back in Australia again. I'm looking forward to seeing you from your comments next year as well. So thank you very much indeed.